Good evening. Hello. I'm Gwen Adshead, and it's my pleasure to give the second of my Gresham lectures. And my theme is Themes of Darkness, and I'm exploring the nature of human violence. And in this second lecture, I'm wanting to focus on perpetrators of human violence. Now, for those of you who missed the first of these lectures, there is a 10-second soundbite, which is that violence is complex. And that's really where I'm starting from, is that violence is an unusual form of human behaviour, and each act of violence is a highly complex act of human meaning. And it's not all the violence is the same, and I'm going to come back and talk about that in a little while. But in this particular, given that that's so, in this particular lecture, what I want to talk about are the perpetrators of human violence. And in this particular talk, just before I start, I really want to acknowledge the help and support of my co-workers. These are people my co-therapists at Broadmoor Hospital, where I used to work. As you can imagine, working with perpetrators of violence is a type of process that really requires lots of minds working together collaboratively. It's not possible to do it on your own, and I just want to acknowledge the help and support of these particular colleagues. And also I'm very grateful to Anthony Perry and the estate of Evie Williams for letting me use some of Evie's pictures. A talk like this probably needs a little health warning, so I've pinched a health warning from Shakespeare. So shall you hear of carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts. So it's just really to warn you that I will be talking about carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts and the perpetrators of those types of acts. And from the same pen, that immortal question, what bloody man is that? So, if each act of violence is complex and outcomes are multiply determined, that raises some serious questions about who perpetrators are and about how we look at violence, and particularly how we record violence. And what I talked about last time was this idea of an ecology of violence, thinking about the micro level of the individual, moving to the macro level about political structures and systems. And I want, in this particular talk, I'm really going to look at very much at the micro level. But before we do that, it's as well just to look at the statistics about violence. Because again, one of the things that we often think is that violence is very common and is really something that we can't escape and is inevitable. And one of the things that I wanted to try and emphasize when I was speaking last time was the idea that violence is not inevitable. Violence is frequent, way too frequent, but it is not the usual behaviour of most human beings. And that, for example, in this country, we have about 2.1 million recorded acts of violent crime. And if you just think about the population of people who could actually be committing acts of violent crime is about 40 million, you'll see straight away that it's only a subgroup of people who are committing acts of violent crime. Now, of course, 2.1 million is far too many, and we need to do much more to try and reduce that number, and I'll say more about that perhaps in my next lecture. And it is entirely possible that some degree of violent crime is underreported. But even if it were 100% underreported, it would still be a minority of people, a minority of the population who are committing acts of violence. So a very small percentage of the population. The other thing that perhaps is not always appreciated is that the majority of victims, by a small margin, but the majority of victims are male. And that's partly because the majority of violence is carried out between young men, that both the perpetrators and the victims are largely young men, often antisocial young men who are under the influence of some sort of substance. And those are often in the context of struggles for dominance and territory, or in the context of property crime, often to do with drugs. We know that quite a lot of violence is not reported, but even so, that wouldn't change the figures dramatically. What is interesting is that not all violence causes injury. you can see here that only 10% of violence, reported violence, causes a very serious injury. There's a lot of violence that's reported, which is very unpleasant and threatening for the victim, but doesn't necessarily cause serious injury. The other thing is that children under a year old are actually statistically the most likely to be victims of violence, and that's particularly true of homicide. And this is not something that we think about very often, but in fact, statistically speaking, even before young men, children under a year old are most likely to be the victims of violence. And that means that the most likely perpetrators of violence are actually the people who attack or kill children under a year old. And those are, by far and away, the majority of those are the parents of those small children. So if we just look at the figures for last year, all of this is available on the Ministry of Justice website. They used to come in wonderful books of data that were a great way of getting yourself to sleep. But the criminal statistics for England and Wales are available, and they do make for very interesting reading. So here are the figures. So over 1 million, nearly 2 million in 2012-2013. Compare that with 2003. So there's been quite a significant decrease since 2003. And if we break those down, you can see that most of them are violence with injury, and then there's violence without injury. 390,000 intimate partner violence. We know that that's probably underreporting, but not nearly as bad as it used to be, because intimate partner violence is actually something that's changed quite dramatically in terms of its sociological status. People are much more likely to report intimate partner violence than they used to. There's a much more open discourse about the unacceptability of intimate partner violence. That doesn't make it any less complicated. It is very complicated, but I think the evidence is, that we're getting truer figures for intimate partner violence than we used to. And then homicides, 526 homicides, so a good year in 2013. That's another drop from the year before. 80% of those perpetrators will be men, and that remains the case really internationally, that the vast majority of perpetrators of violence are men, and I'm going to come back to say a bit more about that later. 15 of those perpetrators will kill themselves, and suicide is a very real risk for a lot of homicide perpetrators, particularly in relation when people have killed somebody within the family. As I say, 23 killed children or stepchildren, and only 4 killed children who were no relationship to them. And that's just really there, so that number is there to remind you that it is vanishingly rare for a stranger to kill a child. But because it's vanishingly rare, each one is reported widely in the press. And so we become quite preoccupied with the risks to children from strangers. But in fact, sadly, children are most at risk from people that they know well, parents and family members. So intimate partner violence accounts for slightly less than half of reported violence, and some suggestion, as I said, that it's reducing. It still carries a high risk of fatality if other risk factors for violence are present, by which I mean if a perpetrator is a very antisocial person with a long history of violence and who's also abusing substances, and if they have any sort of paranoid mental illness, I'm going to come back to that, then there's still a high risk for fatal violence in intimate partner relationships. And we know that because a significant bulk of homicides each year take place in the context of previous intimate partner violence or in the context of a relationship that broke down. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. It's still principally a type of violence which is perpetrated by men on women, but of course that there's a subgroup of women who are involved in violence perpetration, both with same-sex partners and opposite-sex partners. And it's unusual for the perpetrators for male-male perpetrators, male-male relationships and intimate partner violence. So sexual violence. Again, this is an area where we know that there's substantial underreporting, really substantial underreporting. And the phrase sexual violence, literally in this case, covers a multitude of sins. It's quite hard to know. Some of these offences will range from a type of sexual touching, which was unwanted and unpleasant, but not in any way physically damaging, through to sexual assaults that are extremely unpleasant. So, and a lot of these were on minors, on 15-year-olds and 15 and 16-year-olds. 16,000 rapes reported, but we know that that's a substantial underreporting, and the number may be as high as 5 times that number. But one of the difficulties here is that we know that rape is very hard to get first a prosecution and then a conviction. And that's partly because, at least one possibility, and as a study by Susanna Adler about 20 years ago, who looked at the types of rape accusation that went through to conviction, and it really seems like the courts very much operate on a stereotype of what a rape victim looks like. And if a rape victim doesn't fit that stereotype, then it's very unlikely that a case will get all the way through, even to trial, let alone a conviction. And the problem being here that the stereotype of rape, which is a stranger attacking a completely blameless woman walking home after a hard day's work, is jumped by a complete stranger, she can't fight him off, and she immediately goes and reports it to the police. This stereotype really barely exists at all. It's a very, very uncommon type of rape, whereas the vast majority of rape is taking place in the context often of intimate partner violence, often in the context of complex relationships between men and women. So we have a real problem, I think, about stereotypes about rape. We also have a problem about attitudes that support rape as an unpleasant activity, but not that bad. And I think there was a very interesting study that was done in the States by a researcher, a sociologist called Diana Scully. And she studied rapists who were serving sentences in prison. And she said that what was very striking about many of the men that she interviewed is that they were surprised to find themselves in prison because they really didn't think that what they'd done was so bad. And I think that is still, although that case study is quite elderly now, I think that is still the case. And the reason I think that partly is because we know that actually interventions for rapists are not terribly successful. And that's partly because most men who commit rape think that they haven't really done anything very bad or wrong. Violence against children rarely results in either arrest or conviction, but to put it into context, 46,000 children were taken into care last year in England and Wales because of concerns about abuse or neglect by their parents. So that's quite a lot of children. And the abuse is often combined with neglect, and when we talk about abuse, we're talking about types of physical abuse that's hitting, raising bruises, causing causing serious damage. So those are 46,000 perpetrators of abuse and neglect. And 10% of child abuse results often in fatal injury. Child maltreatment can escalate, particularly if children are very young or are vulnerable in some way. And a particular bugbear of mine is that there are no treatment programs for perpetrators of child maltreatment at all. And this is a quote from a young woman who I saw who had broken her little boy's leg. And I was asking her about her relationship with her own mother, and she said, "There's something between us that isn't there." And the poets amongst you will immediately pick up that beautiful ambiguity about something that's present that isn't there, and which really encapsulates the complexity of her relationship with her mother, and something that we can expect may well have been replicated in her relationship with her baby son. That actually when she herself became a mother, that absence was present for her too, and that the violence perhaps was a communication across that absence. And I'm glad to say that this particular young woman did manage to get some treatment, and actually she wasn't able to look after this little boy, but she did ultimately have another child and look after them. I want now just to talk about homicide. We think about homicide as being perhaps, although the least frequent of violence, it is perhaps the type of violence we take most seriously for good reason, for very good reason. And actually homicide is it is a completely fascinating topic. And the Ministry of Justice, and this use a way of classifying homicide, really going an old terminology going back about 30 years now, which is to classify them as normal or abnormal. Now, you may think that raises all sorts of questions, and indeed it does. But these are how this is how you could break them down in terms of the homicides that are analysed by the Ministry of Justice. And what they say is that 50% take place in the context of a quarrel, revenge or loss of temper. 7% took place in the context of a robbery. 7% were described as irrational acts, which is an interesting group. It makes you think about murder as a rational act, and we can come back to think about that. 15% of cases, the circumstances are unknown. So one of the questions that we were left asking, I think, ourselves, is there such a thing as a normal murderer? And those of you who came to my last lecture may remember, and I've actually got it on a slide again, is that the UN study on homicide that was published last year again divided homicides into those homicides that took place in the context of violent crime, those homicides that took place in the context of a relationship, and those homicides that took place in the context of a type of political terrorism. And it's interesting to see how that fits in to this breakdown that the Ministry of Justice have done. So is there such a thing as a normal murderer? Well, this is a picture of a man who I don't know at all. This is a Mr. Webster. He killed his first wife for the insurance and nearly killed a second wife for the insurance. An eagle-eyed investigator spotted the close similarities between the accident that nearly killed his second wife and the accident that had killed his first wife, and Mr. Webster's now serving a life sentence. And I know nothing about him beyond that, beyond the Googleable. But I put this picture up just because I think when we think of a normal murder, a murder for profit seems like something that we might see as being comprehensible, if not, hopefully, not normal. I also think that Mr. Webster is a nice example of a person who looks quite ordinary, that actually doesn't look like someone who's strange. So what are the individual risk factors for human violence generally? Well, these are the factors that we know from, if you look at large-scale epidemiological research, both in Europe and the USA, these are the principal risk factors for violence. And you can see straight away that they're not terribly informative because they don't really help to differentiate very much between people who will be violent and those who won't be. There are a lot of young males out there who will never be violent. So the idea that youth and maleness are risk factors for violence are not terribly informative. This is the problem with actuarial statistics, which don't really tell you very much necessarily about the nature of who and what, the nature of human violence. Substance misuse, we know, is a risk factor because it acts as a disinhibitor and impairs your judgment. So basically, if you're coming into a situation in an angry, hostile, or cruel state of mind, if you've got alcohol or illegal drugs or both on board, that's likely to disinhibit you and impair your judgment. If you're the sort of person who has a persistent antisocial view of the world, if you have a view that the rules don't apply to you, or you have a despite for the rules, or a despite for people who keep the rules, that type of antisocial state of mind is likely to increase your risk of acting violently. And again, that fits in with the United Nations study that I talked about before. Childhood adversity and insecure attachment, I'm going to come on and talk about a bit later on, but this is really the understanding, the very clear understanding that we have that early childhood adversity is a powerful risk factor for all types of adult problem, whether it's adult physical health, adult mental health problems, or indeed violence. And insecure attachment is a particular psychological state of mind that I'll talk about a bit later on. Paranoid mental states. When you read anything, usually in the newspapers, about mental illness and violence, it's usually not true or very poorly reported. There is a relationship. Mental illness does increase your risk of acting violently, very slightly. But that it's really only in the context of people who are in paranoid mental states. And it makes sense, doesn't it? That if you were feeling very frightened and actually believing that people were out to harm you in some way, and you were also antisocial and you were drinking and taking drugs, you can see that such a person is likely to be at high risk of acting violently. And so the people that I work with in secure psychiatric services are people who often have very antisocial states of mind and they have paranoid mental illnesses for which they need treatment. But I think that there is always, or often, there's an unpredictable variable, because you could imagine that a person could be wandering around with all these risk factors, but sometimes it will be one unpredictable variable that will bring all these things together and open up the lock that will make the violence erupt. Now, sometimes that will be something that the victim does. That's not in any sense to blame victims for what happens to them, but it's often something about the way a victim looks or the way they behave or the tone of their voice, which may be the last factor that somehow triggers violence for an individual. The other thing about these risk factors is that they're additive, and this is really just, as you can see, the percentage chance of committing acts of violence depending on how many risk factors you have. And again, that makes sense. In some senses, it's exactly the same type of statistical approach to predicting violence as it is to predicting a car accident. The more risk factors you have, the more likely you are to have an accident, and you go into the high risk band. And it's the same principle for violence. The problem is that when it comes to driving a car, there aren't those strange, those strange individual, idiosyncratic psychological factors that might make you likely to have an accident. Adverse childhood experience, I just want to recap a little bit, because particularly in the context of what I said about 46,000 children being taken into care for abuse and neglect, because we know that those experiences are going to have substantially increase your risk of being arrested for a violent offence, especially if you're a small boy. And these are all the types of adverse childhood experience that we know have an adverse effect on children's development and on their adult functioning. So just hold on to that notion of ACE, ACE, and here is, I'm afraid it's a tiny bit blurry, I'm afraid, but this is just to say your ACE score and the risk of perpetrating domestic violence. And you'll see, if you just focus on the red bars, that the red bars are people who've had 5 or more adverse childhood experiences. And on the y-axis, you can see it's the risk of committing an act of intimate partner violence. And you can see that having lots of adverse childhood experience significantly increases your chance of being violent yourself, and it goes up in a nice stepwise progression. And that's why the interesting question about, well, I had a traumatic experience and I haven't done anything horrible. And there's two reasons for that. One is that you may not have had enough traumatic experiences, that having luckily only 1 or 2 traumatic experiences or adverse childhood experiences can be survivable. And the other thing is that you may be somebody who's quite a resilient person, and because of your resilience, you may have been able to make good use of help that was offered to you as you got older or even when you were a child. What we know about the people who've had very high levels of adverse childhood experience is these are people for whom all the avenues of rescue and repair often seem to go wrong. So these are children who don't get rescued by social services, who don't find an alternative carer, who don't stay in school, who start using drugs early, who start using alcohol early, who go to prison early, who don't respond to psychological interventions in prison, who don't get help when they come out, who develop a mental illness, or perhaps develop a physical illness, where the risk factors just keep coming and nothing goes right. And those are the people who are adding up the risk factors in a very risky way. And you can see, again, that in terms of proportions, the men and the women are not different. It's just the absolute numbers that are different. And I'll come back to say something about that later. This is just to remind me to talk about the study of adverse childhood experience in juvenile offenders. And the blue bars are, for want of a better word, people like us. members of an HMO, a medical insurance scheme in the States. So people like us, and the sort of tan bars, the beige bars, are juvenile offenders in a Florida prison. And if we look on the bottom, you can see that with the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 or more, this is adverse childhood experiences. So you can see right on the left that in terms of 0 adverse childhood experiences, there's a lot more people in the general population who've had no adverse childhood experiences at all, which is great. Although it's interestingly, it is about 35 or 37%. Only about a third of us have had no adverse childhood experience at all. So if you're one of those, you're interesting. And then you can see that as far as the regular population, the numbers, the percentages go down. Actually, it's quite unusual for people like us to have had lots of childhood adversity. But you can see in terms of the prisoners that the numbers steadily go up, and that the largest bar in terms of the young offenders, so these are young men who've offended sufficiently to go to prison, so they must have offended quite significantly to get a prison sentence, that 50% of them have had 4 or more types of adverse childhood experience, and they're statistically different, really, from the Kaiser Permanente, the sort of general population. And this is one of the reasons, one possibility of why this might be, is because of the impact of abuse and neglect on the developing brain. And this is really just, I'm not skilled enough to tell you all the differences, but you can see really on the right-hand side is the brain of somebody who suffered extensive abuse and neglect, and you can see that there's an absence of connection. And what we know so far really is that children exposed to abuse and neglect seem to have much less connections between the different parts of the brain. It's not the places in the brain or even the volume as such. It's the degree of connectivity between the neurons in the different parts of your brain and the different parts of the brain themselves. And what there seems to be for abuse and neglect in children is a decrease in the connectivity, particularly in the frontal lobes. That's the frontotemporal region. This is the bit behind your forehead and behind your eyes, the orbitofrontal cortex. This is the part of our brains that affects basically making choices and being aware of ourselves and other people. And that seems to be a part of the brain that is deprived of neuronal connections in abuse and neglect. And that is a picture of a bicycle lock, just to reinforce this idea that violence happens when you have a number of factors in place at the right time, and then the last factor in the lock can often be quite idiosyncratic. Now, as you know, there are lots of interests in the study of the criminal mind, and if you type the criminal mind or the violent mind into Google, you'll find masses of stuff comes up, and this is a very typical one. This is from Scientific Amendment, the criminal mind, and you can find lots and lots of books and magazines about this, and a lot of interest in looking at the brains of people who've been violent. This is rather beautiful. This is a micro picture of a neuron all blown up. It's rather beautiful. And this is perhaps more typical, quite a lot of studies like this which take pictures of the brains of normal people. I'm assuming for the moment that's us. You can come and tell me later if that's not true. And then there's a group of people called murderers out there, and you take pictures of the brains of murderers, and you take pictures of people like us, and you can show that they're different. And one of the things that's interesting about this is about what it means, really, and about who are the right people to compare, because we know that the people who've done these things are different because they've done something which is so profoundly unusual. Clearly there must be some difference in the way they think and the way that their brains are acting, otherwise they wouldn't have done something very different. So there's a sense in which you'd expect their brains to perhaps light up slightly differently. The question is how they're lighting up differently and what relevance is it when you look at somebody not at the time that they're actually thinking or planning or doing something, particularly in act as complex as murder. Because one of the problems, I think, with these studies is they tend to assume that homicide is one single action. Again, a bit like driving a car. But, of course, it's much more complex than that, and it's not a single uniform type of action. But the pictures are very pretty, and as the technology gets better, the pictures get even prettier. So here's another one. There's the normal control, again, that's us. And then there's a picture of the brain of a deprived murderer, and then there's a non-deprived murderer. Again, and you wonder, I think one of the things that interests me is a bit, what's the right type of study to do here? Who are the right comparison groups? If you're going to take a group of people who've killed, who is the right comparison group? Are they people who've never killed, or are they people who've almost killed? Or people who've been violent but not fatally? What is the right comparison group to look at? One of the other difficulties that the Ministry of Justice also point out is that some homicides represent, as it were, an accidental death, is that there was violence and the victim died. It was not the intention of the person to kill. Now, the law doesn't care about that, because the law says if you were reckless and you took a chance, then that's enough. You don't even have to have complete specific intent. So if you took a chance and somebody dies, then you get charged with murder whether you like it or not. But I think, in logistical terms, there are many homicides that take place by accident, that the person wasn't intended to die necessarily. So if you take a person who's convicted of murder and just call them a deprived murderer or a non-deprived murderer, you may not really be looking at the things that are important. So this was the slide from the UN study of homicide, and I come back to it because I think it's a very helpful way of looking at the meaning of different homicides. So in one group, homicide is very much in the context of the perpetration of criminal acts, usually in the context of territory and possession. So those will be gangs around territory, drug-related crime, where there's a contest between different groups of people around the possession of drugs and the possession of territory. And then the socio-political homicide, this is a homicide related often to terrorism, religious intolerance, and other types of political agenda. And then interpersonal homicide, which is where the relationship with the victim is a key variable. And I think that's, so for me, what would be helpful is if we were to perhaps it would be interesting to do a study of the brains by looking at these different types of homicide and see how similar or different they are. And that's just another depiction of it, just to say that there are different modes of violence, different types of homicide in different parts of the world. In the Americas, there's much more gun crime, whereas in gun-related homicide, whereas in most other countries, the knife or poisons are another way of killing. So this is a slide which looks at the importance of relationships for sexual assault and really picks up on the point that I was making earlier. If you look at the serious sexual assault, you will see that far and away the people who are most likely to be the victims of serious sexual assault, including rape, are most likely to be partners or ex-partners, or else someone known in some way to the perpetrator. Whereas where it comes to less serious sexual assaults, that's where a stranger, someone unknown to the perpetrator, may be less likely, and actually partners are very unusual in less serious sexual assaults. And this really comes back to the point that I was making in my first lecture, which is violence is a communication. And in this case, in serious sexual assault, the message to the victim is "fuck you." You do not matter as a person, and I will use your genitals to ram that message home. And I think it's very important to think about this carefully when it comes to rape trials, because what Susanna Adler's work found, that if there had been any relationship between the victim and the perpetrator at all in the past, that dramatically reduced the chances of a prosecution going ahead or a conviction being achieved. And yet the data tells us that actually serious sexual violence is most likely committed on a woman who has had a relationship with the perpetrator at some time in the past, or may still be having some sort of relationship with him still. And that's just to put it another way. This is for rape, actually, and just to show that partners or ex-partners are most likely to be victims of rape, and strangers are very unlikely. And family members, that's adult family members, less likely still. I want now to move back to thinking about homicide and the question of relationships, because this is a group of men who had no relationships with the people that they killed, and had probably never killed anybody themselves at all. These are the 15 men who were present at the Wannsee conference in 1941 and who oversaw the deaths of 6 million people. It's important, I think, always to remember when we think about the Wannsee conference that these men were in the middle of a war when they sat down to plot, to organise the annihilation of a subgroup of the citizenry. Very expensive activity, and really not terribly sensible thing to do. But the reason I often describe this slide and describe these people is because when we're thinking about people who commit serious acts of violence, we often again think of them as being highly abnormal, very strange people, possibly highly disturbed people, and yet these people who were responsible for the many, many murders were highly articulate and intelligent men. Not a single person there would meet criteria for psychopathy, which I'm going to come on to talk about. But yet we don't often use the word psychopath when we think about men like this. This is a memorial from Reichenau Hospital, which is a psychiatric hospital in Germany, is a reminder again to them that the 508 patients were murdered here at Reichenau, and they were murdered by the doctors and nurses who were looking after them. And again, I think it's important when we're thinking about who is the normal murderer, is to think, is there something wrong with people who kill? Well, the people who killed the patients were the people who had been looking after them only 6 months or a year before. This, however, is the sort of person that we tend to think of when we think about killers. This actually, of course, is a fictional killer, and this is Javier Bardem with a terrible haircut, indicating that he's a psychopath. If only psychopaths were so easily identifiable. This is from a film called No Country for Old Men, which is... Javier Bardem plays a psychopathic serial killer who brutally kills people. Actually, he tends to kill people for money, so you could say it's a normal, if unpleasant, motive. But as I say, this is probably the sort of stereotypical image that we have of people who kill, and it's very effective. And it brings me to talk about the study of psychopathy and psychopaths, because people often will say in the context of violence, particularly homicidal violence, well, aren't they all psychopaths? And I think it's important just to think for a little moment or two about psychopathy. The key name here is Robert Hare, Professor Robert Hare, who's really the international expert on the subject of psychopathy and been studying psychopaths for 30 or so years now. Extremely interesting and erudite man, and his website is worth having a look at. He's very generous with the things he puts on his website. But what he did was to study violent criminals, men, in fact all men, his early studies were all on men, studies violent men who'd been incarcerated in a maximum security prison in the States, and he looked at their psychological characteristics, and he found a subgroup, between a quarter and a third, were people who were very high on interpersonal callousness, were high on a tendency to con and deceive other people. They were affectively detached. They had very little emotional reactivity to things. They often were impulsive and break the rules. They could be quite intelligent, and some of them were even quite charming to talk to. And they also seemed to have a high sense of entitlement and to think of themselves as being very special and other people being rather pitiful and contemptible. And what Robert Hare did was to take these different psychological factors and make them into a type of checklist that you could then apply to people and see if they had these factors and work out whether they might be a risk to other people. And the people who score highly on his psychopathy checklist are the people that we call Hare psychopaths. And these are people who are not only criminal, but particularly violent and particularly likely to repeatedly offend when they're released. Now, one of the key numbers to look at here is that this only applied to about a third of violent offenders. That is to say, the vast majority of violent offenders, even in this federal prison in the States, were not psychopaths on Bob Hare's checklist. And that's been replicated, that finding has been replicated all over the world in different populations. Only a subgroup of violence perpetrators are psychopaths like this. That stereotype, cruel, callous, grandiose, narcissistic, intelligent criminal mastermind. Only a third, possibly even a quarter, of violent criminals would actually meet those criteria. And I can tell you that in most maximum security psychiatric hospitals, very few of our patients meet criteria for psychopathy. Very few of our guys score very highly because they're handicapped by their mental illnesses and they don't have these sorts of problems. But this is a man who probably does fulfill criteria for psychopathy. This is Anders Behring Breivik, who killed 70, where he blew up the government buildings and then went on to kill 70 young people in cold blood and is now living in a maximum security prison in Norway. And if you look at what he wrote, and it's freely available on the web, you can see quite a lot of the factors that Bob Hare talks about. There's entitlement, there's narcissism, there's grandiosity, there's a contempt for vulnerability, there's a belief that he's better than anybody else, and absolutely callous in terms of the suffering that he caused. And again, I put this picture up just because he doesn't look like Javier Bardem with a bad haircut. Well, the haircut may not be great, but there's something here about, if you didn't know, you wouldn't know that this is someone who is a mass murderer, who with very cruel and unusual attitudes. Been a lot of studies of the brains of psychopaths. Again, these brain studies have all the same problems as the studies of murderers. Where do you get your psychopaths from? You only get the ones that are convicted and in prisons. You only get the ones that volunteer to be part of the experiments. You don't get the ones who, perhaps the really smart ones, don't participate in research. But there's quite a number of studies that suggest that the brain functioning of people with psychopathy is a bit different to people like us. And again, I think that's what you'd expect, because we know that already, because they're behaving differently from the rest of us. So there's a sense in which that's not terribly surprising. Again, what's interesting is that the parts of the brain, PFC, prefrontal cortex, cingulate cortex, PCC, posterior cingulate cortex, these are neural pathways and circuits that we know are very important for making decisions with meaning about other people. This is a nice one. You can't see it very well, but some of you will know this. I can't remember his name, but there's a nice professor who's quite interested in psychopathy. He's a neuropsychiatrist, I think, in the States, and he was doing brain studies of psychopaths, and he scanned his own brain and found that he was also a psychopath. And he then went on and gave interviews about how he came from a long line of families with warrior genes. So it's what you have to do to be a professor of neuropsychiatry, is to be a psychopath, which any of us working in academic forensic psychiatry could have told you a long time ago. So we still got quite a lot of questions about psychopathy. Where do these guys come from? Do they arrive on the planet with these strange attitudes and feelings about other people, or do they acquire them through development? Is there a normal distribution of psychopathy in the community? So we take 100 people. In this room, perhaps, there will be 2.5% of you who would meet criteria for psychopathy, 2.5% of you who are the absolute opposite, absolute pussycats, completely exploitable, and the rest of us in the middle, perhaps little bits of psychopathy, perhaps only a bit psychopathic when something else is happening in our lives and we've got something to get done, perhaps only when your teenage son drops wet towels on the floor, whatever it is. Can you be psychopathic and non-violent? There's a lot of research interest in psychopathy in students. And it's very hard to know quite what to make of this, because if these are people who are not violent, then what's the significance of the psychopathy? What's the significance of somebody who was cruel and callous and intelligent and charming, but didn't actually carry out acts of violence, and been a lot of interest, of course, in whether there are psychopaths operating in other contexts. And some of you will recognise that this is the Green Party's political advertising before the election, suggesting that there are lots of psychopaths in government. One of the interesting things about psychopathy is about the question of detachment from emotions. And there's a very interesting link between attachment and what's called dismissing attachment, with an emphasis on normality and strength. So these are people who disavow distress and laugh at pain and that derogation of vulnerability. And there's quite a lot of evidence about dismissing attachment and psychopathy in offenders. And in the last few minutes, I just want to move forward a bit quickly just to show you a few pictures of other people who've killed, and then to share a bit of material from a group that I worked with. These are, of course, two young boys who killed a little boy, and they killed a 3-year-old. They were 10 and 11 at the time. Were they psychopaths? Absolutely not. Are they psychopaths now? Don't know. This is Adam Lanza, who carried out the Sandy Hook massacre and then turned the gun on himself, a young man who was diagnosed with autistic spectrum as a child, not a psychopath. And Harold Shipman, who was a very good GP, apart from on Wednesday afternoons. And this is Elliot Rodger. This is a very sad story. This is a young man who, again, carried out a type of spree killing in Los Angeles a couple of years ago and left a very painful testimony about his sense of isolation and loneliness. A very moving account of his father's meeting with one of the fathers of the victims. But he was a young man who had apparently no adverse childhood experiences at all, and again wouldn't meet criteria for psychopathy necessarily. I think it's worth just spending a minute on the women, because there's no country or culture where men don't make up the majority of offenders. Are the dynamics the same? We don't know. Violent women tend to resemble violent men. They're an unusual subgroup. They tend to kill people they've been attached to at some point. They attack the vulnerable people if they're antisocial. Many violent women have histories of abuse and neglect, so they're not different from the men when they are violent. And the female psychopaths look very similar to the male psychopaths. It's just there's far fewer of them, and we quite really know what that means. It may mean that having 2 X chromosomes is protective in some way, or it may be that that interacts with social stereotypes about women being nurturing, which actually helps to buttress antisocial pressures. This is Eileen Wuornos, who's an exception to the rule. She's one of the few female serial killers. She killed a number of men who she picked up. I think it's fair to say that probably many of the men that she picked up were anticipating having sex with her, and she killed them. She had a very abusive and neglectful childhood. But this is Anne Perry, who killed her best friend's mother. And she went on to become a very famous crime novelist, and some of you will have read her books. She had no experience of childhood abuse or neglect, as far as we know. And this is a woman called Selma Whittingham, who killed her ex-boyfriend. They split up. She was very distressed. She went to confront him. She had a gun, and she shot him. And she served a prison sentence and went on to become a professor in a scientific department, and a very effective member of her community, did groundbreaking research, which has been of enormous value to the community. And it's just a reminder, really, that these stories of homicide are not the same. And here are some quotes from people who've killed. I didn't kill him, I love him, it wasn't murder. I'm not guilty, only guilty of love. I had murder in my heart that day. I looked in the mirror and I said, who the fuck are you looking at? It's done, and I can't bring her back. And then somebody adapting Hamlet, shuffle off your mortal coil, you cunt. And I put these up really to demonstrate just again how varied the types of homicide are. And I think when we look at these words, we think about the states of mind of people who killed, and just think about the diversity of them, and about the idea that there's a normal murderer, I think doesn't really hold up. And I think on that note, I'm going to finish, and we can take some questions.